The day Ralph Warren rode into Dusty Creek, Texas, with nothing but a saddlebag full of coin and a pair of storm-gray eyes that seemed to have already seen the end of the world, was the same day Hester Leland decided she was done asking the Lord for help and was going to fix her fence posts herself. It was the spring of 1878, and Dusty Creek sat in the belly of the Texas Panhandle like a coin forgotten in a coat pocket, small, overlooked, and somehow still worth something to those who knew where to look. The town had a general store run by old Clarence Biggs, a saloon called the Copper Kettle that served whiskey warm enough to take the paint off a barn door, a church with a bell that rang crooked, and a livery stable that smelled of hay and honest labor. There was a sheriff named Abe Coulter who walked with a limp from a horse accident years back and took his job seriously enough that nobody much tested him. The railroad had come within 40 miles of Dusty Creek and then curved away, as if deciding the town was not worth the trouble, and so the people who lived there had built their lives on cattle and cotton and the stubborn refusal to be forgotten. Hester Leland was 27 years old, which in Dusty Creek meant people expected her to have been married for at least 5 years by now. She had been once. Thomas Leland had been a good man, not a great man, but decent and warm in the way that a wool blanket is warm, reliable and unpretty. He had died of a fever 3 years back, leaving her the small farmhouse on the eastern edge of town and 11 acres of dry Texas soil that fought her every single season. She had a milk cow named Bee, a bad-tempered rooster named Senator, a kitchen garden that produced tomatoes and beans and the occasional miracle pepper, and a parcel of land that included her house and 11 acres, plus the run-down, sagging, mostly collapsed lot that sat right up against her eastern fence line. That lot had belonged to old Cyrus Hatch before he drank himself into the grave. Nobody had touched it in 4 years. The building on it had once been a small workshop, but the roof had caved in on one side, the walls had buckled, and whatever Cyrus Hatch had intended to build there had long since surrendered to time and weather. Weeds had overtaken everything. The fence between Hester's land and that lot was half down, which was the reason she was out there in the April heat with a hammer and a bucket of nails when Ralph Warren rode by. He did not stop that first day. She saw him. It would have been impossible not to, because he sat on that horse the way a mountain sits on the earth, like he had always been there and always intended to be. He was tall even in the saddle, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark hat with a brim that kept his face in partial shadow. His horse was a bay mare with a white blaze on her nose, and the animal moved with the unhurried confidence of a creature that trusted its rider completely. He passed on the road that ran alongside her property, glanced at her once with those gray eyes, and tipped his hat in the way a man does when he has been raised to be polite, but is not trying to start a conversation. Then he rode on toward town, and Hester went back to hammering her fence post. She asked Maggie Tilson about him the next morning when she came into the general store for cornmeal and lamp oil. Maggie Tilson was 29, married to the blacksmith, and knew everything that happened in Dusty Creek before it had fully happened. She was sorting bolts of fabric when Hester came in, and she looked up with that particular expression that said she had information she had been waiting for someone to ask about. "That would be Ralph Warren," Maggie said, smoothing a length of calico with her palm. "Came in yesterday afternoon. Stayed at the Copper Kettle last night, not for the whiskey, just the room. Paid in good coin, Clarence says. Didn't gamble, didn't start trouble, had his supper and went to bed." "What's he doing in Dusty Creek?" Hester asked, setting her list on the counter. "That's what everyone wants to know," Maggie said, and her eyes sparkled. "He went and spoke to Judge Harlan this morning, first thing." Judge Harlan, that made Hester set down the lamp oil she had just picked up. Judge Harlan was the man who handled property disputes and the sale of unclaimed land in the county. What would he want with the judge? Maggie folded the calico and set it on the shelf with the deliberate slowness of a woman savoring her moment. "Bought himself a piece of land," she said. "Paid cash money for it, the old Hatch lot." Hester stood very still for a moment. The Hatch lot. That's the one. But that lot is a ruin, Hester said. Apparently he does not mind, Maggie said, and gave her that look, the one that said she was thinking something that Hester had not yet caught up to. Hester collected her cornmeal and her lamp oil and her thoughts, which were scattered in several uncomfortable directions, and walked home. She thought about it for 2 days. The lot next to hers. The lot that shared her eastern fence line, the fence she was already trying to repair. She had, if she was honest with herself, harbored a private hope that nobody would ever buy that lot, that it would simply remain an empty, weedy, caved-in piece of nothing that caused her no inconvenience. A neighbor on that side would change things. A stranger with gray eyes and unknown intentions would change things considerably. On the 3rd day after she learned the news, she saw Ralph Warren walking the perimeter of the Hatch lot, his thumbs hooked in his belt, studying the collapsed workshop with the concentrated expression of a man who was seeing not what was there, but what he intended to put in its place. He had a notebook in his breast pocket. He pulled it out occasionally and wrote something with a short pencil. He was methodical about it, walking the whole perimeter twice. Hester watched him from her kitchen garden for a while before she decided that was foolish behavior, went inside, washed her hands, untied and retied her apron, and then walked out to the fence line. "Mr. Warren," she said. He turned. Up close he was exactly as solid as she had assessed from a distance, not handsome in the way a painting is handsome, but real in the way a well-made thing is real. His jaw was strong and shadowed with a few days of dark stubble, his nose slightly crooked from some old break, and his mouth carried the kind of set that suggested he chose his words carefully. He was perhaps 31 or 32, she guessed. His hat came off immediately when he saw her, which she noted. "Ma'am," he said. "I'm Hester Leland," she said. "I own the property on the other side of this fence." "I know," he said simply. That pulled her up short. "You know. Asked in town before I bought," he said. Seemed wise to know who my neighbors would be. That was reasonable. She rearranged her objections. "I wanted to introduce myself and ask what your plans are for the property. Since we share a fence line, it seems like something I ought to know." He looked at the lot, then back at her, and something behind his eyes shifted in a way she could not quite read. "Planning to build a smithing operation," he said. "I'm a farrier and a blacksmith by trade, looking to set up a permanent shop." Dusty Creek did have a blacksmith, Roy Tilson, Maggie's husband, but Roy was primarily a horseshoeing man, and his shop was small and often overwhelmed with work from the surrounding ranches. A proper smithing operation would not be unwelcome in town. "That will be noisy," Hester said. "Yes, ma'am, it will," he agreed without apology. "I'll work reasonable hours." She looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly polite, trying to understand why this man, who could have set up a smithy anywhere in town proper, nearer to the road, nearer to the larger ranches, had chosen this particular lot. This ruined, overgrown, half-collapsed lot that happened to sit directly against her fence line. "Why this lot?" she asked. "There's a better parcel on the north side of Main Street that's been empty for 2 years. He met her eyes, and there was something very direct and very honest in his gaze, and also something that was clearly not going to be fully said just yet. "This one suited me," was all he offered. She went home unsatisfied with that answer, which meant she thought about it through her supper and her evening reading and into the night, lying in the darkness of the bedroom she had shared with Thomas Leland for 4 years, and had slept in alone for 3, listening to the night sounds of the Texas spring. Ralph Warren wasted no time. Within the week, he had hired 2 men from the surrounding area, a young Mexican man named Enrique who was quick and strong and cheerful, and a quiet older man named Gus, whose last name nobody seemed to know, and they began tearing down what remained of the old workshop and clearing the lot. The work was loud but organized. Hester found herself stopping what she was doing to watch them sometimes. Not because she was fascinated by construction exactly, but because Ralph Warren worked alongside his hired men without any sense of superiority, picking up lumber and hauling debris with the same steady effort he seemed to apply to everything. He was also, she noticed, careful about the shared fence line. He worked within his property and never once let any debris or waste fall on her side. When a length of old roofing came down and landed on her fence, he was over there within 10 minutes with a pry bar, lifting it off, checking the fence for damage, and repairing the board it had cracked before she even had to say a word about it. "You did not need to do that," she said, coming out to the fence to watch. "Caused the damage," he said, working the pry bar with ease. "Seemed right to fix it." She watched him work in silence for a moment. "You said you're a blacksmith and a farrier." "That's right." "Where did you come from before here?" He set the pry bar down and straightened up, and there was a beat of consideration before he answered. "Started in Kansas. Worked cattle drives out of Abilene when I was 17. Picked up the smithing trade in Dodge City. Worked a ranch outside of Amarillo for 3 years after that." "That's a lot of moving," she said. "Yes," he said. He picked the pry bar up again, not to avoid her question, she sensed, but because the fence board genuinely needed another go. "I was looking for somewhere to stop." That sentence fell into the air between them and stayed there, very quietly, while he finished the repair. Hester thought about that for several days. The construction went on through April and into May, and with it came a rhythm that Hester had not expected, the rhythm of someone else's presence beside her. She became accustomed to the sounds from next door. The early morning scrape of tools, the occasional voice of Enrique singing something in Spanish, the deep ring of Ralph's hammer when he was doing preliminary metalwork on a portable forge he had set up under a canvas shelter while the permanent shop was built. She became accustomed to the fact that when she went out to her garden in the early morning, Ralph Warren was already awake and working, and he would see her and nod, and she would nod back, and somehow that small exchange had started to feel like something she expected, something she would notice the absence of if it stopped. It was Maggie Tilson who said what half the town was thinking, 3 weeks after Ralph Warren arrived. She said it in the churchyard after Sunday services, standing with Hester while their neighbors made their way home in the warm May sunshine. "He sits where he can see your property from the copper kettle's porch," Maggie said, without any preamble at all. Hester looked at her. "Maggie." "I'm just telling you what I observe," Maggie said serenely. "He's been in Dusty Creek for 3 weeks. He's had supper at the copper kettle most nights because his kitchen isn't finished yet, and he always takes the chair on the east end of the porch, facing your direction." "That might be coincidence," Hester said. "It might be," Maggie agreed in the tone of someone who did not believe it for a second. Hester had her own things to deal with that May, which gave her good reason not to think too much about the gray-eyed blacksmith next door. The problem was her water situation. The small irrigation channel she had dug 2 summers ago to bring water from the creek that ran at the edge of her property to her kitchen garden and her small vegetable patch had collapsed in 2 places over the winter, and without the channel, she was hand-carrying water from the pump, which was exhausting and inefficient. She needed the channel repaired before the summer heat arrived in earnest. She had the knowledge of how to do it, but not quite the physical strength to shift the heavier clay soil on her own, and hiring labor cost money she was careful about spending. She was down in the ditch one afternoon, hauling at a chunk of compacted clay that absolutely refused to move when a shadow fell over the ditch. She looked up. Ralph Warren was standing at the edge of her property, which meant he had come around through the gap in the fence she had left while she was fixing it, and he was looking down at her with that steady, unhurried expression. "You need a second pair of hands," he said. It was not a question. She was dirt-covered, her sleeves rolled up, her hair half fallen out of its pins, and she was irritated enough at the clay to be past caring about her dignity. "I would not refuse help if it was offered," she said. He rolled up his sleeves and got into the ditch. He was significantly stronger than she was, and the clay chunk that had been defeating her for 20 minutes moved in about 30 seconds when he put his back to it. She was grateful and also slightly aggravated by how easy he made it look. They worked side by side through the afternoon, Him doing the heavy shifting and her doing the shaping and tamping of the soil banks, and it was the most efficient work she had done on the channel in years. They did not talk much while they worked, but it was not uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who were at ease with the presence of another, which Hester found more surprising than the help itself. When the work was done and they were both standing at the edge of the channel, dirty and tired, she looked at him and said, "Thank you, Mr. Warren." "Ralph," he said. She considered that. "Ralph," she said. It felt different from Mr. Warren in a way she was not going to examine too closely right then. "Thank you," he nodded. He looked at the channel they had repaired, then at her garden, then back at the channel. "Good work you've done here," he said. "The garden's well kept." "It keeps me," she said, which was nearly literally true. The vegetables she grew were a significant part of her food through the year. He looked at her then, just for a moment, with something in his expression that was neither pity nor admiration, but some combination of respect and something softer that she did not have a name for. Then he said, "Good evening, Mrs. Leland," and walked back through the gap in the fence to his own property. She stood there in the early evening light and realized, with a clarity that was slightly startling, that she was going to have to make a decision about what she was doing with the feelings that were starting to accumulate in her chest like water in a well, slowly, steadily, and whether she paid attention to them or not. She was not a foolish woman. She was not a woman who chased romantic notions without examining them first. She had loved Thomas, in the way you love something steady and known. This was different, sharper, more uncertain, more alive in a way she had not expected to feel again. She was not sure she entirely trusted it. She was not sure she entirely trusted herself around Ralph Warren, which was itself a kind of answer. The following week, she asked him directly. She had been thinking about it for days, and she had decided that she was not the sort of person who circled around things endlessly, and that if she was going to have a neighbor for what might be years, she wanted to understand the situation clearly. She waited until the evening, when the construction sounds had stopped, and Ralph was sitting on a crate outside his half-built shop cleaning his tools, which he did with the same methodical care he applied to everything. And she walked up to the fence and said, "Ralph." He looked up. "Why did you buy this lot?" she asked. "And I want the real answer this time, not that it suited you. There is a better parcel on North Main and a larger one south of the stockyard, and both of them would be better for a smithing business because they're closer to the road. So why this one? Why this broken-down, weedy, half-collapsed lot that backs up against my fence?" He looked at her for a long moment. There was something working behind his eyes, not evasion but consideration, the consideration of a man who does not say things carelessly and is deciding how much to say. "You know why," he said. 2 words delivered quietly and with a certainty that was more intimate than a speech would have been. Hester Leland felt the words land somewhere deep in her chest and rearrange something there. Her hands, resting on the top rail of the fence, tightened slightly. She looked at him and he looked back at her, and the Texas evening settled around them with its purple sky and its cricket song and its warm, dry air, and there was no ambiguity whatsoever in what he had just said. "Ralph Warren," she said slowly, "how long have you been in Dusty Creek?" 6 weeks, he said, "and before that—" "I came from Amarillo," he said. "Before that decision," she said, "how long were you deciding?" Something shifted in his expression, a softening, and underneath it, something almost like vulnerability, which on a man that solid and that contained looked like a crack in stone that let you see the light inside. "Since I saw you in Amarillo," he said. 8 months ago. You were there visiting your cousin, I think. You were at the market. You were arguing with a merchant about the price of a bolt of blue cloth, and you were completely right, and he was completely wrong, and you knew it, and you did not back down even when he got loud." Hester stared at him. "I remember that," she said. She remembered it clearly. Old Beaumont's dry goods, the merchant who had tried to charge her twice the fair price and had been highly put out when she declined to pay it. "You were there." "I was buying chain," he said. "I saw you. And then I found out your name and where you lived, and I thought about it for 8 months, and then I did what I should have done 8 months ago." The straightforwardness of it was breathtaking. Not smooth, not calculated, just honest in the way only genuine feeling can be honest. She had not been courted in years. She had not expected to be. She had been telling herself she did not need it, which was the kind of thing a person tells themselves when the truth is too tender to look at directly. You bought a ruined lot next to my property because you saw me arguing about fabric 8 months ago, she said, not unkindly, just making sure she had it right. I bought it because it's next to your property, he said, and because I'm a practical man who needed a place to build, and because I figured if I was going to do the ridiculous thing of following a woman I barely know to a town I've never been to, I might as well do something useful with my hands in the meantime. She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Almost. She pressed her lips together and looked at the half-built shop, at his tools laid out on the crate, at the cleared and graded lot that had been a disaster of weeds and collapsed timber 6 weeks ago, and she thought about the channel he had helped her dig, and the fence board he had fixed, and the chair on the east end of the copper kettle's porch. I am not a simple woman to get to know, she said. I know that, he said. I'm not looking for simple. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, I suppose you had better come to supper tomorrow evening and we can start there. The expression that came over Ralph Warren's face at those words was one she would think about later, in the way you think about something you want to remember exactly right, not triumphant, not relieved exactly, but something like a man who has been traveling a very long time and has just caught sight of home. Yes, ma'am, he said. I'll be there. She walked back to her house and stood in her kitchen for a few minutes with her hands flat on the table, feeling her own heartbeat in a way she had forgotten she could. Supper the next evening was roasted chicken and cornbread and green beans from the garden, and a dried apple pie that Hester had been planning to save for Sunday, but decided was appropriate for the occasion. Ralph Warren arrived exactly on time, which she had already expected of him. He brought a small jar of honey from the general store, because he had asked Clarence Biggs what Hester Leland liked, and Clarence had told him she had a weakness for honey. He said grace before the meal, quietly and without showmanship, and they ate at her kitchen table and really talked, the kind of conversation that moves from one thing to another naturally, like water finding its course. She learned that he was 31, that he had grown up in Missouri, that his father had been a cooper and his mother had been a school teacher, that he had gone west at 17 to work cattle drives because he had been young and restless and had needed to find out what he was made of. He had found out he was made of iron and persistence and a deep need to build permanent things, which was why he had eventually traded the cattle drives for a smithy's hammer. She told him about her parents, who had come from Virginia when she was a small child and had farmed on the outskirts of San Antonio. She told him about Thomas, she told him plainly, because she was not a woman who hid her history, and because if Ralph Warren was going to sit at her table, he deserved to know the shape of her life. She told him Thomas had been a good man, and that she had grieved him honestly, and that she had then gotten on with the business of living, because that was what you did. Ralph listened to all of it without filling the silences with unnecessary words, which she found she respected enormously. After supper he helped her clear the table without being asked, which made her blink, because in her experience that was not typical behavior. He noticed her noticing and shrugged slightly. My mother's house, he said. Nobody sat while someone else cleaned up. She found herself smiling. She had not smiled that way in a while, not the small, polite smile of daily interaction, but the kind that comes from somewhere genuine. He left at a proper hour, thanked her for the meal with a sincerity that was entirely unperformative, and walked back through the gap in the fence to his own property. She watched him go, and then she washed the dishes and went to bed and slept better than she had in a long time. The weeks that followed had a quality that Hester would later describe to Maggie as both the most ordinary and the most extraordinary time of her life. On the surface, nothing dramatic was happening. Ralph was building his smithy. She was working her farm. They were neighbors, but underneath that ordinary surface, everything was shifting with the slow inevitability of seasons changing. He had supper at her table twice a week. She began going to watch him work sometimes in the late afternoons, sitting on an upturned crate on her side of the fence with her mending in her lap, not because she needed to watch, but because she liked the sound of the hammer and the sight of the forge fire, and the way Ralph moved around his work with such purposeful competence. He would talk to her while he worked, which was not something she had expected. He was not a talkative man in company, but alone with her he was different, not chatty but communicative, sharing his thoughts in the same methodical way he approached everything. She learned that he had opinions about the cattle drives and the way the men who ran them treated both the animals and the workers. She learned that he had once spent a winter outside Dodge City snowed in with a Cheyenne family who had taken him in when his horse threw him and he had broken his wrist, and that he spoke of that time with deep respect, and none of the contempt she knew some men carried for the tribes whose land they had taken. The injustice of what had been done to the Plains peoples was not lost on him. He spoke of it with the bluntness of someone who had seen the wrong of it firsthand, and had no patience for pretending otherwise. "The land we're all sitting on," he said one afternoon, looking out at the flat Texas horizon with those gray eyes that seemed to go all the way to the edge of something, "was somebody else's before it was ours. Seems right to remember that." She liked that about him very much. She filed it away with the other things she liked about him, which were accumulating at a rate that was beginning to make her nervous in a not entirely unpleasant way. The smithy was taking shape rapidly now. The walls were up and solid, the roof was on, the forge was properly installed, and Ralph had begun the process of hanging his tools in the organized system. She could see through the open double doors. He had a gift for ironwork that was immediately apparent. The first time she saw him at a full forge, working a piece of metal with his hammer, shaping it with a precision and confidence that were beautiful in a purely functional way, she understood that this was what he was meant for. The metal obeyed him, not because he forced it, but because he understood it, its properties, its limits, its potential. Word of his skill spread quickly through Dusty Creek and the surrounding ranches. Within 2 weeks of opening his doors properly in June, he had more work than he could easily manage alone. He hired Enrique full-time and took on another apprentice, a young man named Caleb from one of the nearby farms who had a natural aptitude for the work. The shop became a productive, orderly, busy place that was exactly what it was supposed to be. Roy Tilson came to see him early on, which Hester had been slightly concerned about. 2 smiths in a small town had the potential for bad feeling. But Roy was a sensible man, and Ralph was a sensible man, and they worked it out over an afternoon and a handshake. Roy would continue with his horseshoeing and light repair work. Ralph would take the heavier ironwork, wagon wheels, machinery parts, structural work for the buildings going up as the town slowly grew, and the 2 operations would refer work to each other as needed. Maggie Tilson reported to Hester that Roy had come home from that conversation in a good mood, which settled the matter. It was a July afternoon, about 3 months after Ralph had come to Dusty Creek, that things moved beyond supper twice a week and afternoon conversations over a fence. They had gone together to the Independence Day celebrations in town, not formally, not declared as anything, but together in the way that everyone in Dusty Creek was already treating them as together, whether they had announced it or not. They had watched the children's foot race and the shooting contest, and they had eaten fried bread from a stand near the church, and they had sat together on a bench watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that the Texas Panhandle did with more drama than anywhere else Hester had ever seen. When the last of the color had faded and the first stars were coming out, Ralph said, quietly, "Hester." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the sky, and then he turned and looked at her with those direct gray eyes, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her with its calm, "Yes, I know. I'm not a man who is good at saying things before I mean them," he said. "So I'm going to say something now that I mean entirely." He paused, not from hesitation but from the habit of choosing words carefully. "I have been in love with you since the day I saw you in Beaumont's dry goods, and I am considerably more in love with you now than I was then, and I intend to go on being in love with you for as long as you'll permit it." She looked at him for a moment. The stars were coming out above them, the Milky Way beginning its slow wash across the dark, and the night was warm and smelled of dust and summer grass, and somewhere in the distance there was music from the copper kettle. "Ralph Warren," she said, "I am going to tell you something that I have been telling myself for about 2 months is not true, and that I am now prepared to admit is entirely true." She folded her hands in her lap and met his eyes. "I am in love with you too. And I want you to know that it is not a small or uncertain thing. It is a large, somewhat inconvenient, and very definite thing." He reached over and took her hand, which was the first time he had touched her beyond a brief handshake and the necessary contact of working side by side. His hand was large and calloused and warm and entirely certain in the way it held hers. She let her fingers lace with his. They sat like that until the music stopped at the copper kettle and the night had deepened around them, and the stars were in full display. And it was one of those evenings that memory stores with particular care, the way a library preserves rare books. The courtship that followed, if you could call it a courtship when it felt more like a recognition, like two things finding their proper alignment, was conducted with the same combination of practicality and depth that characterized both of them. They were adults who had each been shaped by loss and work and the necessity of independence, and neither of them was interested in pretending to be anything other than what they were. They talked about real things, how they each handled money, what they believed about religion and the church and the God they both recognized without being certain they understood, how they felt about children, what they wanted their lives to look like in 10 years. They went on walks in the evenings when the heat had subsided, sometimes talking constantly and sometimes not talking at all, just walking together in the slow way of people who are comfortable in each other's company. He read to her sometimes. He was a better reader than she had expected, with a deep voice that gave language a particular resonance, and she had a small collection of books that he worked his way through with genuine interest. She in turn had a head for mathematics and practical accounting that he appreciated enormously when she looked at his business records and found 2 errors that would have cost him significant money at tax time. There were, of course, complications. There always were. The first came in the form of a man named Garrett Slade, who arrived in Dusty Creek in August with a business proposition and a manner that Hester disliked immediately and completely. Slade was from Dallas, ostensibly representing a land development company, and he had his eye on several properties in the area, including, it turned out, the lot that Ralph had bought. He came to the smithy one afternoon, while Hester happened to be sitting at the fence working on her mending, and she watched the conversation from a distance without being able to hear it. She could read the body language clearly enough. Slade talking at some length, gesturing expansively, Ralph listening without expression, Slade making what appeared to be an offer of some kind, Ralph shaking his head in a definitive way that left no room for misinterpretation. Slade left. Ralph watched him go, then turned and walked toward the fence, and his expression as he arrived had a controlled quality that suggested the conversation had irritated him. "He wants to buy you out," Hester said. "Among other things," Ralph said. "He's got a scheme to buy up several properties on this side of town, combine them, and sell to a mining company that's apparently looking to set up an operation in the county." "Mining?" Hester sat up straight. "This is farming and ranching country." "That's what I told him," Ralph said. "He says there's copper to the east." "And what happens to the farm families on those properties if he buys them out?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. "They go elsewhere," Ralph said, with a flatness that meant he found this as unacceptable as she did. "Did he make an offer on my property?" she asked. "He mentioned it," Ralph said. He'll be coming to talk to you." He paused. "You are not obligated to sell." "I know I am not obligated," she said, but she felt the chill of it. She had seen what happened to farm families displaced by men like Garrett Slade, who arrived with Dallas money and legal documents and smooth manners that concealed the hard fact of what they were doing. They were not illegal, exactly. They made offers, and the offers were technically voluntary, but they had ways of making the voluntary feel somewhat less so. Slade came to her door the following afternoon, right on schedule. He was a well-dressed man in his 40s with a pleasant face that worked very hard and told you nothing true about what was behind it. He made his offer in polished language that dressed up a very straightforward proposition. He would pay her $140 for her 11 acres and the house. She could relocate anywhere she liked. Hester sat across from him at her kitchen table with her hands folded on the surface and let him finish. Then she said, without heat but without any softness either, "Mr. Slade, this land is mine. My husband broke this ground and I have kept it for 3 years since he died. I have no interest in selling it for any price. Good afternoon." Slade's pleasant face went through several internal adjustments, and then he said, in a tone that was 1 degree less pleasant, "Mrs. Leland, the company I represent has considerable resources and considerable patience. It would be in your best interest to—" "Good afternoon, Mr. Slade," she said again, and rose from her chair and held the door. He left. She closed the door behind him and stood in her kitchen with her arms crossed, feeling the particular anger that comes not from fear, but from the recognition of being treated as someone whose judgment and choices are not to be fully respected. The trouble with Slade did not end there. Over the following 2 weeks, he bought out 2 of the small homesteads to the east of town, the Byad family and the old widow Sampson, both of whom had been in difficult circumstances and had accepted his price. He made 2 more visits to Hester, both of which she declined in increasingly direct terms, and 1 visit to Ralph that resulted in Slade leaving the smithy considerably faster than he had arrived. It was after his 3rd visit to Hester, when he had brought a legal man from Dallas with him who had waved documents in a slightly threatening way, that Sheriff Abe Coulter got involved. Hester had gone to Abe the morning after that visit and laid out everything clearly, and Abe, who walked with a limp and had no patience for men who used legal language to bully people, went to the Copper Kettle where Slade was staying and had a conversation with him that apparently involved some specifics about what the law permitted and did not permit in terms of coercing landowners. Slade left Dusty Creek 4 days later. The mining company scheme, as it turned out, had not been on as solid a footing as he had implied. The copper deposit east of town was far smaller than advertised, and the company pulled its interest once the true survey came back. The whole thing deflated like a poorly made bellows, and Dusty Creek went back to its regular rhythms. What the episode left behind was something useful. It had shown Hester and Ralph, with complete clarity, that they each faced the same challenges from the same direction and made the same choices about them. There is a kind of knowing that comes from watching how someone behaves when things are difficult, and what she saw of Ralph Warren during those weeks confirmed everything she had already come to understand about him. He was not the sort of man who stood back while things happened. He was not the sort of man who bullied or who backed down when confronted with bullying. He was steady and principled in the way that is not dramatic because it does not need to be. It is simply the way the person is constructed. It was September when Ralph Warren asked Hester Leland to marry him. He did it without elaborate staging or theatrical gesture. He did it in the kitchen of her house after supper when she was putting the kettle on for tea and he was sitting at the table with his coffee cup between his hands. He said, "Hester, marry me." And there was in those 2 words such completeness, such uncomplicated certainty, that she felt the whole shape of it perfectly clearly. She turned from the stove and looked at him. She had thought about this because she thought about everything, and she had come to know that what she felt for this man was not transient and not uncertain, and not something she needed more time to evaluate. She knew the things about him that mattered. He was honest, he was hardworking, he was kind in the specific way that means treating people with consistent dignity rather than performing kindness when it was convenient. He had walked 8 months and 800 miles for her, which was either the most sensible or the most romantic thing she had ever heard, and she had decided it was both. "Yes," she said, "I will." He let out a breath that told her, very quietly, how much he had wanted that answer. He rose from the table and crossed the kitchen to where she stood, and he took her face in his large, careful, calloused hands, and he kissed her not quickly, not hesitantly, but with the same thoroughness he brought to everything he did that mattered. She kissed him back with everything she had been holding in check for months, and the kettle began to steam on the stove, and neither of them paid it any attention whatsoever. They were married in October, in the Dusty Creek church with the crooked bell, which rang enthusiastically and off-pitch, and with complete sincerity on their behalf. Maggie Tilson cried through the entire ceremony and was not even slightly ashamed of it. Roy Tilson stood with his arm around his wife and beamed. Enrique, who had become genuinely fond of both of them, wore his best shirt and brought flowers. Clarence Biggs closed the general store for the afternoon, which was an almost unprecedented honor. Sheriff Abe Coulter came in his best vest and shook Ralph's hand with a grip that meant he approved. Hester wore a dress she had made herself from a length of blue calico, not the same bolt that she had argued about in Beaumont's dry goods in Amarillo, but the same color, which Ralph noticed, and which made him smile in a way she thought was one of the finest things she had ever seen. After the ceremony and the celebration in the churchyard, which involved Clarence Biggs producing a fiddle he had not played in years and playing it with more enthusiasm than precision, they walked home together through the October evening. Their home, now the two properties that had always shared a fence line and that would now be, in every practical sense, one. They had talked about the gap in the fence and had decided to make it a proper gate, which Ralph had forged himself from iron in a design she had sketched out for him, with morning glory vines worked into the metal that looked as close to the real thing as iron could manage. Ralph had moved his personal belongings into Hester's house, which was more established and more comfortable than the rooms he had built for himself behind the smithy. The smithy remained its own separate operation, which was appropriate and proper, and the house remained the house, which was home. The first winter of their marriage was one of the best winters Hester had ever known. The Texas Panhandle winters were not gentle. The northern winds came down from the plains with a cold that could be vicious, and the house needed constant tending to stay warm. But Ralph had spent the autumn reinforcing the insulation, replacing the cracked hearthstones, and building up a woodpile that was twice the size Hester had ever managed on her own. They spent the long evenings by the fire with their books and their conversation, and the simple, extraordinary comfort of not being alone. They were also, as the winter wore on, expecting a child. Hester had told Ralph in November, watching his face carefully because she was not sure exactly how he would receive news that had been delivered before any conscious planning on either of their parts. What she saw was a stillness, and then a kind of careful joy, the joy of a man who handles precious things carefully. "You're certain?" he asked. "I've been certain for 3 weeks," she said. "I wanted to be sure before I said." He put his hands on her shoulders and looked at her with those gray eyes that she now knew as well as she knew her own hands, and what was in them was not anxiety or complication, but love, direct, straightforward, entirely present. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you all right?" "I am perfectly well," she said, "and very glad." He drew her in and held her, and she felt the solid, reliable warmth of him around her and thought, yes, this is the shape of the life I want. The pregnancy was uncomplicated, which Hester was grateful for. The local doctor, a lean, serious man named Dr. Whitfield, who had come to Dusty Creek from Ohio 5 years ago, and had seen enough to know what worried and what did not, checked in on her regularly and pronounced her constitution excellent. Maggie Tilson, who had a 4-year-old daughter and a toddler son of her own, was an invaluable source of practical wisdom and cheerful company. Ralph was consistently, quietly attentive without being anxious. He took on the heavier work around the farm without being asked, and without making a production of it. He was there in the mornings when the nausea was worst, with tea and plain crackers and the steady presence of someone who is simply going to wait with you through the difficult parts. He talked to her in the evenings about what he was thinking about for the property in the spring, a larger vegetable garden, possibly a second milk cow, and something she had mentioned wanting and had not entirely expected him to remember. A proper porch on the south side of the house where she could sit in the evenings with the light. He built the porch in February on the days when the weather allowed. He built it solid and level, with a railing she could lean against, and a long bench along the wall that was exactly the right height. He built it without ceremony and without requiring thanks, which was how he built most things. She thanked him anyway, thoroughly, and he said her thanks were more than sufficient payment for any amount of work. Spring came, and the baby came with it. Their son was born on a clear April morning in 1879, exactly 1 year after Ralph Warren had ridden into Dusty Creek with his saddlebag and his gray eyes, and his intention to stop moving. He was born in the bedroom of the house with Dr. Whitfield attending and Maggie Tilson there for support, and Ralph was outside on the south porch that he had built for Hester, waiting with the particular kind of patience that is not easy or calm, but that is held together by will. When Dr. Whitfield came out and told him he had a son, and that Hester was well, Ralph stood for a moment looking out at the spring morning, at the field and the fence and the gate with the morning glory vines worked into the iron, and the sky above it all. Then he said, "Thank you," to the doctor and went inside. She was in the bed, tired and bright-eyed, with the baby, small and red-faced and entirely himself, lying against her. Ralph sat on the edge of the bed and looked at both of them, and whatever he felt in that moment lived entirely behind his gray eyes and was not for public expression, but she saw it and knew it, and it was everything. "He looks like he has opinions," Ralph said, after a moment's solemn study of the infant. Hester laughed, which she had not expected to have the energy to do. "He is already extremely emphatic," she agreed. They named him James, which had been Ralph's father's name, with Thomas as a middle name, which was Hester's offering. James Thomas Warren arrived in the world and in Dusty Creek with the thoroughness of a person who intended to stay. The year that followed was full in the way that good years are full, not with drama, but with life. James was a vigorous, demanding, deeply charming baby who had his father's gray eyes and his mother's jaw, and a personality that appeared to be entirely his own. The smithy flourished. Ralph took on 2 more regular accounts with ranches 30 miles east, which meant Enrique ran the shop 2 days a week while Ralph made the circuit, and Ralph hired Caleb permanently. The farm also flourished. Ralph's additional labor through the seasons made a tangible difference, and the vegetable garden he had expanded in the spring produced so abundantly that Hester was able to sell surplus at the general store, which added to their resources in a satisfying and genuinely useful way. There were ordinary difficulties. A bad month when 3 of Ralph's largest accounts paid late and the household finances were tight. A summer illness that laid both Hester and young James low for a week with a chest cold. A disagreement between them about a business decision Ralph was considering that was sharp enough to leave them both quiet for an evening before they talked it through properly, and found the solution that incorporated both their perspectives, which turned out to be better than either individual position had been. They had learned that year the particular art of disagreeing without doing damage. It was not instinct. It was something they had to work at, because they were both people who had strong ideas and were accustomed to being right about things, and the friction of 2 such people in a shared life required conscious navigation. But they were both also, underneath the stubbornness, committed to something larger than being right, and that commitment was what mattered. Hester's life had a fullness in it now that she recognized with an almost physical gratitude. She had the farm, which was doing better than it had in years. She had the smithy next door. She no longer thought of it as the Hatch lot or the ruined lot, but as Ralph's place, the forge with its fire visible through the open doors in the cold months, its sound a constant companion to her days. She had her books and her kitchen garden and her south porch where she sat in the evenings. She had Maggie Tilson, who came for tea on Thursdays and maintained her complete mastery of every piece of information in Dusty Creek. She had James, who at a year old was pulling himself up on everything and had recently developed a strong interest in going to the smithy to watch his father work, a preference Ralph indulged with careful supervision and genuine pleasure. And she had Ralph steady, present, honest, entirely himself. She had him at the breakfast table and on the south porch in the evenings and in the bed where the nighttime conversation, she had discovered, was some of the best conversation she had ever had, the kind that happens when defenses are fully down and thought travels freely. She had him in all the particular ways that a marriage lived deeply makes a person present to you, not as a romantic abstraction, but as a complete human being with his specific ways of doing things, his preferences and his moods and his humor that was dry and appeared without warning and was entirely wonderful. She loved him with the fullness of a woman who has thought about it carefully and chosen it freely and knows exactly what she has chosen. One evening in the summer of 1880, when James was 15 months old and had just taken his first unassisted steps across the kitchen floor, an achievement he then celebrated by sitting down hard and looking extremely surprised, they were sitting on the south porch in the last of the evening light. James had been put to bed. The air was still and warm. Across the gate, the smithy was dark and quiet, the forge cold for the night. Hester looked at Ralph, who was leaning back in the porch chair with his long legs stretched out and his hat off, and his face relaxed in the particular way it was only relaxed when everything was right. She thought about Beaumont's dry goods in Amarillo in 1877, when she had been arguing about the price of blue fabric and had not known this man existed. She thought about the morning he had ridden past her fence with those gray eyes and that bay mare and had tipped his hat and ridden on. She thought about asking him why he had bought the lot next to hers and the particular certainty of those two words. You know why. She had known why. That was the honest truth of it. She had known why even then, and had needed him to say it to be certain that she had not imagined it. Ralph, she said. He looked at her. He was always fully present when she spoke to him, which was one of those small specific things that she valued beyond easy expression. I'm glad you followed me home, she said. He looked at her for a moment with those gray eyes that she knew better than any eyes in the world, and then the corner of his mouth curved up in that unhurried way. So am I, he said. She reached over and took his hand, and his fingers closed around hers, and they sat like that while the Texas stars came out above the panhandle in all their ridiculous abundant glory, and the night settled around them like a blessing, and Dusty Creek was quiet and warm and entirely sufficient. That autumn Hester discovered she was expecting again. This time she told Ralph within a week of being certain because she had learned that he preferred to know things directly and early, not because he worried but because he took preparedness seriously as a form of care. He received the news the same way he had received it the first time, with that careful stillness and then the quiet joy. When? He asked. Spring again, she said. March, I think. He nodded. He looked at her with all the fullness of what he felt and said, You're well. I am very well, she said. He kissed her forehead and then her mouth and then went to the smithy, and she discovered when she went to investigate the sounds an hour later, had begun building an additional piece of furniture for the bedroom that would serve as a proper cradle, with ironwork accents in the design he had developed for all the permanent pieces in the house. The morning glory vine motif, worked in small, careful curves around the wood frame. She stood in the doorway of the smithy and watched him work in the lamplight. This man who expressed love with his hands and his presence and his particular way of thinking ahead to what would be needed, and felt something in her chest so large and so warm that it was almost difficult to contain. The second baby came in late February of 1881, arriving somewhat ahead of Hester's March estimation, and with considerably more urgency than James had managed, so that Dr. Whitfield barely made it in time, and Ralph had been called back inside from the south porch in considerable haste. This child was a daughter, small, pale, and furious about something from the first breath, with a set of lungs that impressed everyone present. Ralph held her in his large hands with the focused care of a man who understands that the thing he is holding is both tremendously fragile and tremendously strong, which was exactly what she was. He looked at her with an expression that Hester was fairly sure no one in the world had ever seen on Ralph Warren's face before, completely undone, entirely in love, entirely happy. They named her Clara Louise Warren, after Hester's mother, and Clara proceeded to announce her presence in the household with great consistency and enthusiasm. James, who was nearly 2, was initially suspicious of this small, loud interloper, and then, within about a week, entirely devoted to her, which was a trajectory Ralph observed with quiet satisfaction. "He'll look out for her," Ralph said, watching James toddle over to Clara's cradle and peer in with the concentrated attention of someone very small taking a very large responsibility seriously. "She may not require it," Hester said, listening to Clara exercise her opinions about the afternoon light. "Maybe not," Ralph agreed, "but he'll offer it anyway." Dusty Creek grew through 1881 and 1882. The railroad, which had curved away from the town years ago, was rerouted in 1882 to come within 15 miles, which changed the economics of the region in ways that were mostly beneficial. New families came. A second church was built. A schoolhouse was established on the north side of town, which was a matter of great celebration, and which Hester had campaigned for actively through a series of letters to the county seat that had been, by general agreement, extremely persuasive. Ralph's smithy expanded with the growing demand. He built a second forge room and took on a fourth worker, a man named Patterson who had come from the east looking for work, and had turned out to have a genuine gift for detailed ironwork decorative pieces, gates, railings, the kind of work that the town's growing ambition was beginning to require. The operation had become something substantial, and the income it generated allowed Ralph and Hester to make improvements to the farm and the house that had been long desired and long deferred. The porch got an extension. The kitchen got a proper iron range to replace the old stone hearth cooking. The bedroom got a new floor of hardwood that Ralph laid himself over a winter, plank by careful plank, with the same methodical dedication he brought to all construction. Hester got the bookshelves she had wanted for years, floor to ceiling on one wall of the sitting room, which Ralph built, and which she filled over the subsequent years with deliberate and happy intention. James grew from a baby into a toddler into a boy who had his mother's quickness of mind, and his father's physicality, big for his age, easy in his body, happiest when he was doing something with his hands. He spent enormous amounts of time in the smithy, first watching and then, as he grew older, helping in the small ways that a careful child can help in a smithy without getting hurt. Ralph taught him the basics with the same patient thoroughness he brought to teaching anyone, and James absorbed it with the concentration of a child who has found the thing that interests him most. Clara was, from approximately the age of 3, a force of nature. She had her father's gray eyes and her mother's absolute willingness to argue her position until one of them was proved right, and she had an additional dimension of stubbornness that seemed to be entirely her own contribution to the family's character. She was also deeply affectionate, a hugger, a child who climbed into laps and pressed her face against necks and held hands without self-consciousness. She made Ralph, who was not a demonstrative man by nature, into someone who came home from the smithy every evening and crouched down so she could fling herself at him, which she did without fail, every single day, and which he received every single day with the same quality of expression that Hester had first seen on his face when he held Clara as a newborn, the look of a man who cannot fully believe his luck. It was 1884, 6 years after Ralph Warren had ridden into Dusty Creek on his bay mare, that Hester found herself sitting on the south porch on a Sunday afternoon, while Ralph was in the yard with James and Clara, teaching them both to throw a rope. Clara was 6 and James was 5, and they were both deeply serious about the endeavor. The bay mare, whose name was Duchess and who was elderly now and semi-retired but still sound, stood in the yard with the patient dignity of an animal who has earned her comfort, serving as the practice target. The afternoon light was exactly right, that long golden Texas light of late summer that made everything it touched look permanent and valuable, the way certain moments feel permanent even as you are inside them. Hester had her mending in her lap, but she was not mending. She was watching Ralph hold Clara's small hands around the rope and guide the motion, talking to her in the low, measured voice he used when teaching, and watching Clara's face as she concentrated, the pure, fierce concentration of a 6-year-old who has decided she is going to master this specific thing today. She thought about Amarillo in 1877 and the bolt of blue fabric and the merchant who had tried to cheat her. She thought about the April morning when a man on a bay mare had ridden by her fence and tipped his hat and said nothing and everything. She thought about a question she had asked over a fence rail and 2 words that had answered it completely. She thought about the life that had grown up between that moment and this one, the channel dug and repaired, the gate with the morning glory ironwork, the supper table with its familiar 4 chairs, the bedroom with its hardwood floor, the smithy that rang and glowed next door, the bookshelves full of volumes they had read to each other, the 2 children in the yard, the man who had followed her home and built permanent things and meant every single word he had ever said to her. Ralph looked up from his work with Clara and met Hester's eyes across the yard. He had always, she thought, been able to find her in a space without looking for her. He simply knew where she was. She thought he always would. He held her gaze for a moment with those gray eyes, and in them was everything that had been there on the day he had said you know why. That directness, that certainty, that particular quality of a man who has stopped moving and found what he was looking for. And underneath it, layered over 6 years of shared life, was something richer and quieter and more complex than anything that first look had contained. Love does that when it is the real kind. It deepens rather than fading. It develops new dimensions rather than wearing smooth. It becomes more itself over time rather than less. She smiled at him. He smiled back, that slow, unhurried movement at the corner of his mouth that she still thought was one of the finest things she had ever seen. Clara's rope went wide and missed Duchess by several feet. Clara made a sound of profound dissatisfaction. James, who had been watching with brotherly attention, offered technical commentary that Clara dismissed with a wave. Ralph returned his attention to the lesson, crouching down to show her the motion again, patient and exact. Hester picked up her mending and set it down again. She leaned back in her chair and looked at the sky, which was that particular Texas blue that has no adequate description, and at the yard and the gate and the smithy beyond it, and at the family she had not planned and had not expected and would not trade for anything the world contained. The September of 1884 brought good news of a particularly concrete kind. The county agreed to fund the Dusty Creek schoolhouse expansion that Hester had been advocating for since the previous year. The school currently held 22 children in a room built for 15, and with the new families continuing to arrive, the situation had become genuinely untenable. The expansion would add a second room and allow for a second teacher, and the county's decision was met in Dusty Creek with the kind of relief that communities feel when something they needed and feared they would not get is finally confirmed. Hester had been the primary force behind the advocacy campaign, writing letters, organizing meetings, traveling once to the county seat with a delegation that included Maggie Tilson, Roy Tilson, and Sheriff Abe Coulter to make the case in person. The sheriff's presence had perhaps helped, Maggie suggested. Maggie was probably right. Ralph had supported the effort without question and without requiring explanation, which was the kind of support she valued most, not performative cheerleading but genuine practical backing. When she had needed to travel to the county seat, he had arranged his schedule at the smithy and managed the children without making her feel guilty for going. When the county's decision came back positive, he read the letter she brought home and said simply, "Good. You did that. We did that," she said. "You managed the children for 3 days. That's a different skill set," he said, and his expression suggested that 3 days managing James and Clara without backup had been an informative experience. She laughed. He was laughing too, which was one of her very favorite versions of him. Ralph Warren, genuinely amused, was a sight that never lost its pleasure because it was so entirely unguarded. The school expansion was built through the autumn, with Ralph's smithy providing the ironwork for the new building's hardware at cost, which was his contribution to the effort, and which he made without announcement. Hester found out about it from Maggie, who had found out from Clarence Biggs, who had found out from Roy Tilson, who had been told by the county contractor. When she asked Ralph about it that evening, he looked mildly put out that anyone had mentioned it. "It's a school," he said. "It seemed right." She looked at him across the supper table, at this man who was quietly and consistently the person she had come to understand he was, and felt the familiar warm weight of loving him settle around her like the wool blanket that warmth actually is when it is real and earned and mutual. "It seemed right," she agreed. That winter, Hester began teaching reading and arithmetic to 3 of the Mexican family's children in town on Saturday mornings, at the kitchen table, informally and without pay. These were children whose families worked the surrounding land and who did not yet have the language or the confidence to be fully comfortable in the formal schoolroom, and Hester had the Spanish not fluent but functional, learned over the years partly from Enrique, who had been patient with her, and the willingness to meet them where they were. It was not a large thing, she told herself, but it was something, and something was always better than nothing. Ralph understood this about her without requiring explanation. He would take the children, James and Clara, on Saturday mornings, to the smithy or on some errand or adventure of his devising, leaving the kitchen table clear for her lessons. He did it without comment or credit, week after week through the winter, until the spring came and 3 children could read simple sentences and do their sums and walked into the Dusty Creek schoolhouse in March with a confidence they had not had in September. Christmas of 1884 was the Christmas Hester kept most clearly in memory in the years that followed, not because of any extraordinary event, but because of its particular quality of completeness. They had a tree, a small cedar cut from the creek bank and brought into the sitting room, which Clara decorated with paper ornaments she had made at school, and which James decorated with a string of painted wooden beads Ralph had turned on a lathe during his evenings in November. Hester made her mother's gingerbread recipe, and the house smelled of it for a week. Ralph gave her a set of books she had mentioned wanting in August, which meant he had been keeping notes since August, which was so entirely him that it made her chest tight with warmth. She gave him a new pair of work gloves she had made herself, which was a practical gift, and then, because she had been thinking about it for a long time, a small iron figure she had commissioned from Patterson at the smithy, a woman at a fence rail, and a man on the other side of it, just small and true. He held it for a long time without speaking, and when he looked up his gray eyes were clear and direct and full of everything he did not need to say. They sat up late that Christmas night after the children were in bed, in front of the fire with their tea and their books, and the comfortable silence of 2 people who have built a life together that fits them both. The wind was up outside, one of those winter northers that came off the plains with cold determination, and the fire was warm and the room was lit with the particular amber quality of firelight, and Hester thought, This is the thing. This is what the word home is supposed to mean. She said as much, or close to it, and Ralph looked at her from across the hearth and said, with that quiet certainty that was the way he said everything that mattered, yes. The years moved forward with the generosity of years that are good ones. James at 7 was reading at a level that impressed his teacher considerably, and had developed a sideline in fixing things, small mechanisms, clock gears, the hinges on boxes, anything with moving parts that could be disassembled and reassembled. The smithy was clearly in his future, or some variation of it. Clara at 8 was, as she had always been, entirely her own creature, ferocious at her schoolwork, deeply loyal to her friends, capable of an argument that would have done credit to a much older person, and still, always, the child who came to find whichever parent she needed and pressed herself against them without preamble when something was hard. Ralph's smithy had become one of the anchor businesses of Dusty Creek. When the railroad depot 15 miles away generated a regional construction boom in the mid-1880s, the smithy was busy with structural ironwork that kept the whole operation running at capacity for 2 years. Ralph expanded again, this time adding a small attached store where finished ironwork goods, tools, hardware, decorative pieces, could be purchased directly, which created a retail business alongside the custom work and brought in a different kind of trade. Hester's farm had grown beyond what she had thought possible in the first hard years after Thomas. She had added a second milk cow, which she had been talking about since the first year of her marriage to Ralph, and a small flock of laying hens, and the vegetable operation had expanded to the point that she supplied the copper kettle with fresh produce through the growing season. She was not a rich woman, but she was comfortable and entirely independent in the sense that mattered. She had resources of her own, work she chose, and choices she made freely. She was also, she realized in the spring of 1886, expecting a third child. She was 35, which gave her a moment's consideration, but Dr. Whitfield, who had been their doctor through everything and had become, over the years, a friend, was reassuring, and she was healthy, and Ralph received the news with the same quality of response he always had, careful and present and entirely glad. "A third," he said. "A third," she agreed. He looked at her with those gray eyes and said, "You are remarkable, Hester Leland." She had kept her own name in the middle way she used sometimes, not a formal thing but a personal one, a way of acknowledging all the parts of herself. He had always understood that without needing it explained. "Warren," she said. "I have been Hester Leland Warren for 7 years. All of them remarkable," he said. She threw a dish towel at him, which he caught, and the kitchen was full of the kind of laughter that only happens between people who are deeply comfortable with each other. The third child was born in November of 1886, in the bedroom of the house that had by now absorbed so much of their shared life that it felt like a living thing rather than a structure. Another boy, and a large one, the largest of the 3, who came into the world with a force that made Dr. Whitfield raise his eyebrows and Hester decide she was done at 3, which seemed a reasonable and well-reasoned conclusion. They named him William Henry Warren, after no one in particular and both of them in general. He was from the first a calm, observant child, different in temperament from both his siblings, happy to lie in his cradle and study the ceiling with focused interest rather than demanding constant entertainment. James, who was 8, appointed himself William's primary protector. Clara, who was 7, appointed herself William's primary entertainer and educator. William seemed content to accept both roles offered, and regarded his siblings with the thoughtful patience of a small person who has very recently arrived and is taking careful stock of the situation. Ralph held William the first night of his life and sat in the chair by the bedroom window with the baby in his arms and the lamplight making the lines of his face both familiar and somehow new. And Hester, watching from the bed, thought about the whole length of the thing, from the bay mare and the gray eyes and the tipped hat, to this room, this man, these children, this life she had built and been given and chosen all at once. "Ralph," she said. He looked up. "Are you happy?" she asked. He considered the question with the seriousness he gave to things that deserved it. He looked at the baby in his arms and out the window at the darkness where the smithy stood silent and dark for the night, and then back at her. "I am the happiest I have ever been," he said, "and I believe I will be happier still, given time." She held out her hand, and he took it across the small space between chair and bed, his large calloused fingers warm and certain around hers, and they stayed like that until William fell asleep, and the lamp burned low, and the Texas night was quiet outside the window. Dusty Creek in 1888 was a different town than it had been when Ralph Warren rode into it on a spring afternoon 10 years earlier with a saddlebag and a pair of storm-gray eyes. It had grown not dramatically, but meaningfully. There were more houses, a second general store, a proper hotel where the copper kettle used to handle most of the traveler accommodation, a telegraph office, and the expanded schoolhouse that was now staffed by 3 teachers. The railroad depot 15 miles east had made the town less isolated, and the beef market that the ranches fed into had made it less poor. The community had complexities, as all communities do. There were families who had been there for years, and families newly arrived. There were men who thought the old ways of doing things were the only ways, and men who were willing to consider otherwise. There were injustices that Dusty Creek shared with every western town of its era, the way certain people were treated differently because of where they had come from or what language they spoke at home, the way the law was not always equally applied. Hester and Ralph were not people who could look at those things without saying something about them, which had made them occasionally unpopular with certain people and reliably well regarded by others, which seemed to them like exactly the right trade. Abe Coulter had retired as sheriff in 1886 due to his worsening hip, which he had finally admitted was not a limp from a horse accident but an old injury that had been getting worse for years. His replacement was a younger man named Harvis who was competent and fair, and who had come to Ralph early in his tenure and asked his opinion on several matters, which Ralph had given clearly and without embellishment. Harvis and Ralph had developed a mutual respect that was useful to both of them and to the town. Enrique, who had worked for Ralph since the first days of clearing the hatch lot, had by now become the senior man of the smithy in terms of day-to-day management, skilled, reliable, and widely trusted. He had married a woman named Rosa in 1882, and they had 3 children and a house 2 streets over from the smithy. He and Ralph had the relationship of men who have worked side by side for a decade and know each other through action rather than declaration, which is a particular kind of friendship that is both solid and undemonstrative and entirely real. Caleb, the apprentice from the early days, had moved on to set up his own blacksmithing operation in a town 30 miles north, which Ralph had encouraged and supported, and which Caleb had acknowledged with a letter that arrived 2 months after his departure, saying, simply, that he owed more to Ralph Warren than he could easily say, and that he intended to run his shop by the same standards. Ralph had read the letter at the breakfast table and folded it carefully and put it in the small box on the mantelpiece, where he kept the few things he considered worth keeping. Hester had watched him do it and had not said anything, because some moments do not benefit from commentary. James was 10 in 1889 and had formally begun working in the smithy after school on the days Ralph allowed it, which was regulated carefully because Ralph was serious about education and did not allow the smithy to compete with schoolwork. But when the schoolwork was done, the smithy was open to him, and the boy moved through it with an ease that was both inherited and natural. He was learning the forge under his father's supervision, which at 10 meant supervised observation and simple bellows work, and learning the properties of different metals, the basics from which everything else would build. Clara was 9, and her current fierce interest was in the mathematics of the Saturday lessons Hester continued to offer. Hester had expanded the informal Saturday school over the years, and it now had a dozen regular students. Clara had lately taken to helping, which meant sitting beside the younger children and explaining the concepts in terms she had invented herself, which were often more effective than the conventional explanations. She was going to be a teacher, Hester thought, or a lawyer, possibly both. William was 3, sturdy and calm, and already showing the observant quality that had characterized him from birth. He watched everything carefully before engaging with it, which was so different from how either James or Clara had operated that his siblings found him both puzzling and wonderful. He had his father's gray eyes exactly, and they gave his small face a startling, considering quality. It was a Sunday in May of 1889, and the south porch was getting its annual cleaning and repair check. Ralph was on his knees checking the corner posts, which had made it through the winter in good shape. James was helping, handing tools on request with the attentiveness of a boy who takes his helping seriously. Clara was in the kitchen helping Hester with Sunday supper, which mostly meant narrating her opinions about everything while nominally stirring things. William was sitting on the porch steps in a patch of sunlight, doing what he did, watching, considering, being entirely present in some internal way that was difficult to describe. Hester came out to the porch to check on the post inspection, and looked at the yard and the gate with its morning glory ironwork and the smithy beyond it, and at Ralph on his knees checking the post with James beside him with the serious face of a 10-year-old with a job to do, and at William on the step in his patch of sunlight. Ralph sat back on his heels and looked up at her, and his face in the May afternoon light was the face she knew better than any other, lined a little more than it had been 11 years ago, weathered by years of forge heat and Texas wind, and more entirely itself than it had ever been, the gray eyes clear and direct and warm. She thought, this is the answer to everything I ever asked. She thought, you know why? Yes, I always did, she thought. Look at what grew from that answer. Look at this Sunday morning, this porch, these children, this man, this life that is mine completely. Hester, Ralph said, in the tone that meant he was about to ask something practical, like whether the Southwest Post needed a new bolt. The Southwest Post needs a new bolt, she said, because she had already looked at it. He blinked. Then that corner of his mouth moved. I know, he said. I was going to say that. I know you were, she said. James looked between his parents with the long-suffering expression of a child who has been observing this particular dynamic for his entire life and finds it simultaneously inexplicable and comforting. William, from his step, observed with those gray eyes and showed no opinion. Clara appeared in the doorway behind Hester. Supper needs 20 more minutes, she announced with the authority of someone who is 9 and has been in charge of the stirring. And I have decided that the corn pudding is going to be exceptional this week. You are all welcome. Thank you, Clara, Ralph said solemnly. You are all very lucky, Clara agreed and disappeared back inside. James caught his father's eye, and Ralph's expression was all the response necessary. And James grinned. And Hester stood on the porch of the house she had lived in for over a decade with the man she had found across a fence rail, and loved in all the ways that love can be lived. Through work and conversation and disagreement and resolution, and the ordinary extraordinary weight of 2 lives wound together into one. She went back inside to check on Clara's exceptional corn pudding, and the world went on around her, the smithy next door, permanent and solid, the gate with the morning glory ironwork, the yard where Ralph and James were still on their knees at the post, the boy on the porch step with the gray eyes watching everything. That evening, after supper, which was indeed exceptional, a fact Clara acknowledged with dignity, and after the children were in bed, she and Ralph sat on the south porch together in the spring night. The stars were out in their full, ridiculous Texas abundance. The air smelled of the season changing. The smithy was dark and the night was quiet, and the gate stood open as it often did in the warm months, making one space of the two properties that had once been separated by a broken fence. "Do you ever think about it?" she asked. "The day you rode in?" "Sometimes," he said. "What do you think about?" He was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was actually thinking rather than waiting to talk. "I think about how certain I was," he said, "and how little I knew, both at once." "Certain about me," she said. "Certain that I wanted to know you," he said. "Everything else I discovered after." "And was it what you expected?" she asked. He turned and looked at her in the dark, and the starlight was enough to see those gray eyes and what was in them. "It was considerably more than I expected," he said, "and better, and harder in the good way." And he paused, and the pause was not the pause of a man at a loss for words, but the pause of a man choosing the right one carefully, as he always did. "And exactly right," he said. "All of it, exactly right." She leaned against him, her head against his shoulder, and felt the solidity of him. The same solidity she had assessed from a distance 11 years ago, which had proven to be as real as it looked and deeper than she had known to imagine. His arm came around her, warm and certain, the way it always did. They sat on the south porch he had built for her, under the Texas stars in the spring of 1889, with the smithy dark next door and the children sleeping inside, and the life they had made together settled around them like something permanent, like something that had always been going to happen if they simply had the courage and the sense to let it. And it had been exactly that. And it was exactly right. The morning glory vines on the iron gate, Ralph's design, worked in careful curves into the metal years ago, had over the years been planted with actual morning glories, which climbed the iron in the warm months and bloomed in colors that Hester thought were the finest possible commentary on the whole story. Real vines on iron vines. Living things growing through the permanent things. All of it together making something neither could have made alone. In the fall of that year, when the summer was fully over and the light had gone to gold, and the garden had given its last of the season's abundance, Hester sat down and wrote a long letter to her cousin in Amarillo. The cousin she had been visiting the day she had argued with a merchant about blue fabric, the day a man buying chain had seen her, and begun the 8-month consideration that had ended with a bay mare and gray eyes, and a ruined lot next to her fence. She wrote about the children and the farm and the smithy and the school expansion and the Saturday lessons and Ralph. She wrote about Ralph at some length, in the way a woman writes about a man when she is not performing for anyone but simply trying to find the language for something very large. She wrote, "I asked him once, at the beginning of it all, why he had bought the lot next to mine. I asked because the lot was a ruin and there were better parcels available, and the whole thing made no practical sense. And he looked at me the way he looks at everything that matters to him, and he said, 'You know why.' And the truth is that I did know. I had known from the moment he tipped his hat and rode on, and I felt the absence of his presence before I had even properly registered his presence. I knew why, and I needed him to say it, and when he said it, everything else followed as naturally as spring follows winter, as morning follows the dark. I am," she wrote, "a very fortunate woman. Not in the passive way of someone to whom good things happened, but in the active way of someone who recognized the right thing and reached for it, and found that the reaching was reciprocal." She sealed the letter and put it on the pile for the next day's post wagon and went out to the south porch, where William was sitting in his usual contemplative way, watching his father and James come through the gate from the smithy at the end of the workday. James talking at some length about something that had happened at school, and Ralph listening with the full attention he gave his children. Clara appeared from around the corner of the house with a bunch of late tomatoes from the garden in her arms, and stopped to intercept her father and brother, adding her own report of the day to James's with her characteristic thoroughness. Ralph's hand came out and touched Hester's shoulder as he passed, without looking. He simply knew where she was, as he always did, and the touch was brief and warm and entirely enough. William looked up at his mother from his porch step. His gray eyes, so precisely his father's, held the same considered quality. He was 4 now, and his observations had begun to come out in short declarative sentences that were generally quite accurate. "Everyone is here," he said, with the satisfaction of a person for whom that was the most important fact in the world. Hester sat down on the bench beside him and looked at her family in the yard in the gold afternoon light, in the town they had made their home, and felt the full weight of it not as something to be carried, but as something to be held. "Yes," she said, "everyone is here." And they were. And the gate stood open between the two properties that had once been separated by a broken fence, and the morning glories had gone to seed for the winter and would come back in spring, and the smithy would ring tomorrow, and the farm would keep on keeping her, and the children would grow, and the life would go on full and imperfect and irreplaceable and entirely, exactly right. Ralph came up the porch steps, James and Clara still talking on either side of him, and he looked at Hester sitting with William in the last of the afternoon light, and she looked back at him, and between them passed everything that did not need to be said because it was simply true. All of it, always, exactly this.